This is part 7 of our series on Catholic social teaching, which is centered around 7 major principles. We've already covered the first 4. Number 1, the dignity of human life. Number 2, community and family. Number 3, rights and responsibilities. And number 4, the preferential option for the poor. And I have one more topic regarding the preferential option of the poor, and that is immigration. The topic of immigration is obviously a huge issue. It's in many ways a divisive issue. It's really a complex issue and a difficult one. And I guarantee that there are some elements of Catholic teaching on this issue that many of you might even disagree with. And I'm not here to get into the politics of, the approaches into solutions of the issue of immigration. I'm only going to try my best to present the issue from the perspective of the Gospels. Hopefully, I've earned, 10 years of preaching some trust on this. But I also want to give some of my personal experience, not too much of it though. So when I say something like the Catechism says, I'm literally reading directly from church teaching. When I'm telling a story, I'm giving you my sort of practical experience. Your experience might be different because you're not a priest and you're not me. So the Catechism says that, quote, the more prosperous nations are obliged, to the extent that they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of the security and the means of livelihood which they cannot find in their country of origin. So, we are obliged to help people who have no security in their own countries. But the Church is also clear that those who immigrate must do so according to the laws of that country. Catechism says, immigrants are obliged to respect with gratitude the material and spiritual heritage of the country that receives them, to obey its laws, and to assist in carrying civic burdens. So, in other words, they must obey the law and become an active part in that nation and contribute to the overall well-being of that nation. And I see this a lot, in my students. I would say probably about 15 to 20% of them are of Hispanic background. And maybe it's because I teach at a private school and those kids are generally come from a pretty, steady, solid home life. But maybe I don't experience an accurate snapshot of the entire community, but in my experience, these immigrant families are incredibly hardworking. Most of them own their own businesses. If we didn't have immigrants, the population and the economic output of our nation, and particularly the state of Nebraska, would be incredibly diminished. Think about agriculture, construction, landscaping, building roads. A lot of the work that is done by immigrants is a lot of the work that we don't want to do ourselves. And anecdotally, I'll say that, the people that come to me asking for gas money or for food from the food pantry, 99% of them are addicts or suffer from mental health problems, and 99% of them are white. Immigrants generally contribute to society. And yes, there can be things like language barriers. Sometimes bad actors come across borders. And to a lot of people, that's a problem, and that's understandable. But, in my experience, while their grandparents never learned English, my Hispanic students' parents grew up in a Spanish-speaking household, but they learned English. My students are bilingual, but they don't speak Spanish regularly at home even. They don't even have accents. And their children will probably never learn Spanish unless it's, an elective in school. And it was the same way with my family. My grandpa would tell stories about how my great-grandparents on my grandmother's side barely learned any English. My grandmother could speak Czech, but she never really did around us. And my mother only speaks English and never learned but a couple of words of Czech, and I know like 2 words of Czech. So it's sort of this process of cross-pollination where the culture kind of adds to each other and builds upon each other. And it happens naturally, and it contributes greatly to society. Even, like scientifically speaking, one of the best deterrents to the spread of disease is to have a genetically diverse population. It's like if you only had one kind of tree in a forest, one bug or one fungus could take out the entire forest. And I think, sort of analogously, we have a lot to learn from each other. Other cultures can teach us a lot about things that we could be doing better. Things like caring for our elders, respecting our parents, the value of hard work. We can all learn from each other. The Catechism continues, public authorities should see to it that the natural right is respected that places a guest under the protection of those who receive him. And this is where things get a little complicated and where I can't really speak to the politics and the solutions, but just kind of think about it a little bit. This is where the Catechism speaks of natural rights. So there are rights that we have that don't come from the government. These are rights that are owed to us because we're human beings. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. These rights exist, and we have responsibilities because of them, responsibilities to the community, to the government. And these natural rights include things like food and water and shelter and access to health care, etc. And because of those natural rights, we certainly shouldn't be tearing families apart when it comes to immigration. That's the second principle of Catholic social teaching, community and family. If we are on the one hand talking about how important family is and protecting families, and on the other hand we're cheering for when certain families are broken apart and deported, then there's something wrong there. That doesn't sound like the gospel that I grew up hearing. And I will admit that I am maybe personally biased on this one, personally affected by it. My sister and brother-in-law were terrified when the ICE raids began because they were arresting and deporting people that were legal citizens of the United States. There's been at least 70 cases where completely natural citizens who were born here were deported and taken away from their families. And my brother-in-law, he was born here. He was born a U.S. citizen, and yet they were still afraid to leave their house because he had Central American ancestry. But I guess the real question is, what if people come here illegally? Do they still have those rights? This is something that's debated in politics, but it's not really anything that's debated in the church. Do they have rights under law? If they aren't under the law, they do because they're human beings. If we start saying that basic human rights only come about as a result of legal citizenship or immigration or the government, then we start to go down some very, very dark roads that lead to things like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Russia. Our rights come from God, not from the government. Which puts us in a difficult situation in our country. Our country is so great that a lot of people want to come here, and it can be overwhelming. What if someone is so desperate to leave their country of origin that they're willing to die for it? What if they're willing to walk through an uninhabitable desert to get here? What if they're willing to be financially taken advantage of in order to get here? What if they're willing to take the chance of getting caught? It's kind of like the starving kid stealing bread that I talked about last week. Maybe we should make it easier for them to get some bread. When people are crying out for help, it's kind of our job to help them. It's not, not my problem kind of thing. We have to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of the poor. What would you be willing to do to have a better life, or a better life for your children? What would you be willing to do to try and escape violence and poverty and seek a better life? And I hear, this is kind of my personal opinion, so don't take it as gospel, but I hear politicians saying, no, we just want to cut back on illegal immigration. And I get the impression that this is just a disguise for saying you don't like immigrants, especially from poor countries. And there's a bit of historical significance behind this line of argument. So in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act dramatically reduced the number of immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the flow of immigrants coming into Ellis Island slowed to a trickle. The percentage of immigrants in the United States population went from 15% of the population to 4% of the population overnight. Why did they pass that law? It's because they wanted to limit the number of immigrants from specifically poor Catholic countries and encourage immigration from Northern Europe, which is traditionally non-Catholic Protestant countries. And I'm sure glad that my grandmother's family made it here before that. Otherwise, I wouldn't exist and I wouldn't be Catholic. If we don't welcome someone because of the way that they look or sound or the things that they believe, that's against the gospel message. Our mission is to spread the gospel, not to limit those who have access to it. We have to ask ourselves, what would Jesus do, not what would so-and-so politician do? So what do we do? You know, the Catholic Church, the Catechism says that we should welcome the less fortunate, but also it says that immigrants should respect immigration laws. So how do we reconcile those two? The general rule of thumb is that when they're here, regardless of how they got here, we should help them. And by help, I don't mean that we do anything illegal. By help, I mean that we allow the government, which has the right to handle the legal side of things. But when we have the chance to feed them, to teach them, to clothe them, to care for them, rather than to dehumanize them or to make them into villains, we should do so because they're children of God. We should be able to fight things like, gang violence without demonizing everybody that looks like the gang members, or everybody that looks or sounds different than we do. I think we all agree that people should immigrate legally. Most of us agree that people shouldn't break the law in order to get here. The debate is how to address that problem. And I don't have the political solutions. I'm not going to pretend to. Thank God, I'm not a politician. I have my own thoughts, but those are just personal thoughts, and I'll keep those to myself. The church simply says that while a nation has a right to secure its borders, we must address the issue with human rights in mind while caring for the least of God's children. And once we have that understanding, then we allow our conscience to make decisions on things like policy and voting for certain politicians. So that's the fourth principle, preferential option for the poor. I'm going to save the fifth principle for next week because the topic of immigration sort of flows better into the sixth principle of Catholic social teaching. And the sixth principle is justice and solidarity among nations. And this is another challenging, politically charged topic, but I'm just going to tell you what the church says. So, solidarity is this idea, it's the virtue of seeing our neighbor as our brother and sister. And this extends to the international level, not just to our communities. St. John Paul II, talking about solidarity, he was very careful to caution. He said, solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or a shallow distress at the misfortunes of other people, both near and far. On the contrary, solidarity is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. So in other words, what St. John Paul II is saying is that solidarity is not simply recognizing and feeling sorry for and complaining about the world's problems, it's actually taking action in regards to the world's problems. The Catechism does note that there is a gap between nations on the international level. It says on the one side there are those nations that possess the means of growth and development with resources and economic capability, and on the other side of that gap there are nations who are impoverished financially, impoverished of natural resources, impoverished of political stability, or all of three of those things. The Catechism says this: rich nations have a grave and moral responsibility toward those which are unable to ensure the means of their development by themselves or have been prevented from doing so by tragic historical events. It is a duty in solidarity and charity. It is also an obligation in justice if the prosperity of the rich nations has come from resources that have not been paid for fairly. This is straight from the Catechism. It is our responsibility as a wealthy nation to come to the aid of those in need out of charity. Thankfully, we live in the most generous nation in the history of the world. But obviously, we have to take care of issues at home first, but it can't just stop there, this America First stuff. It has to go beyond that. We must also reach out to other nations and work with other nations to form alliances to combat the evils of the world. We can accomplish very little on our own. It took the entire Western world, just in my lifetime, joining together to tear down the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. The Catechism specifies that there are two types of aid. There is, number one, direct aid in response to immediate extraordinary needs caused by natural catastrophes, epidemics, and things like that. But then there's the aid that we give to contribute to a lasting solution to a country's needs. And this is done through international economic and financial institutions. It's not just up to one nation like the United States, it's up to nations working together. And by our continuing our support of poor countries, working for growth and working for freedom, Catechism says that this needs to be applied especially in areas of agricultural labor, because poor subsistence farmers in the third world make up the overwhelming majority of the poor. And we do a good job of that here in Nebraska. I'm pretty proud of it. If you go up to the University Extension in Curtis, there's students from all over the world that go there to learn proper farming practices. Pope Francis says that the lasting solution is the ultimate goal because, quote, solidarity means much more than engaging in sporadic acts of generosity. It means thinking and acting in terms of community. It means combating the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work, land, and housing, denial of social and labor rights. You might wonder, well, where does it end? And Jesus promises the poor you always have with you, so it won't end. Our duty is to help the poor wherever they are. The Catechism is very careful, and it's explicit in saying that it's not the role of the church to describe the details of how this aid is given. The Catechism leaves that up to the voters, to legislators, to executives of those nations. It says, quote, it is not the role of the pastors of the church to intervene directly in the political structuring and organization of social life. This task is part of the vocation of the lay faithful acting on their own initiative with their fellow citizens. So it's an all-together thing, not a church telling us how to do it kind of thing. And this is parts of the rights and responsibilities that I was talking about 2 weeks ago. Our rights as human beings describe our responsibilities as citizens to help our neighbor, even when our neighbor is on the other side of the world. And that's not to say that care for other nations or the poor from across the world should detract from our care for the poor in our own communities, because there's a ranking in these. So the 7 principles of Catholic social teaching, they're in this order that I'm going through for a reason. They're ranked from most fundamental to least fundamental. And since preferential option for the poor is number 4, and solidarity with other nations is number 6, then we go to the poor in our own communities first. But generally, and theologically speaking, we all come from the same parents, Adam and Eve. We all have the same Father, God. The Catechism says we are one human family, whatever our national, racial, ethnic, economic, and ideological differences. We are our brothers and sisters' keepers, wherever they may be. Loving our neighbor has global dimensions. St. John the 23rd said that the solidarity which binds all together as members of a common family makes it impossible for wealthy nations to look with indifference upon the poor. So it's that bond with each other that gives us compassion. And when it comes to implementing solidarity, that's left to the people negotiating alliances and treaties and trade agreements. Those negotiations can include debating who should and pay for what and how much. And that's the purpose of government. And that is well within the rights of those governments. But the principle of solidarity states that we should never cut ourselves off or break promises or treaties with other nations, or worse, abandon those nations once we've messed things up. Going in and deposing a dictator and then doing nothing afterwards, that's problematic. St. Paul VI taught that if you want peace, work for justice. If you want peace, work for justice. In other words, people are simply less likely to fight if they have enough, if their needs are being met. The gospel tells us to be peacemakers. Our love for all our brothers and sisters demands that we promote peace in a world that is never at peace. And in terms of our own nation, we're in a privileged place to offer the most help. We're the wealthiest nation in history. Why have the money if we aren't going to use it to make the world a better place? In the book of Genesis, for example, God blesses the nation of Israel, not so that they can bask and wallow in their own glory, but so that they can bring all the nations to God through them. We can be that nation. And today's readings are jam-packed with this very topic. I didn't plan it this way, it just happened this way. Every single reading is about inviting the foreigner into God's kingdom. In our first reading from Isaiah, he says, "The foreigners join themselves to the Lord, and I'll bring them to my holy mountain, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." Our responsorial psalm tells us, "O God, let all the nations praise you." In our second reading, St. Paul tells us that he was appointed as an apostle to all the nations. In our gospel today, Jesus heals the daughter of a foreign woman, even though he was sent first to the lost children of Israel. I will admit, once again, rather embarrassingly, that these topics the last couple of weeks are difficult, because we'd rather just kind of be left alone, right? And as I said last week, caring for the poor, it's not easy, and at times it's not even enjoyable. But I am greatly encouraged by all of you, by this parish. I'm probably preaching to the choir when I'm talking about all this stuff. You probably know it already, because you've always risen to the occasion of caring for the poor when I've asked for your help. When I asked for contributions to fund to our fund for the needy, you responded overwhelmingly, and you gave enough that will hopefully last for years. Whatever is going on in our nation and in our world, I know that we can rise above it as brothers and sisters, rich and poor, because we are all children of our Father.